They feel nihilistic like that for a reason. And keep going. Anyway, in summer 2025, Clavicular enters into a content house with a number of other young male, like fitness and working out, self-improvement, yada yada. Clavicular sort of stands out as a shock jock within the context of this content house. He has a habit of saying the N-word. He would just say it to get a reaction out of other people. Like there's clips of him like walking into a restaurant and just like saying the N-word and people just kind of like being like, what? And I don't know, that aspect of his come up is sort of just like pathetic and desperate to me.
Pathetic and desperate, yes. Effective. My first ever hit tweet was like Omegle racism. For those who may not know in the who are listening, is like a chat app thing where people just will randomly talk to other random people online. And it's a very white thing. And so if you are a person of color of any sort, you are going to get called slurs as soon as it becomes apparent that you're a person of color. And it's always by children. That's for a lot of reasons. But one thing I pointed out is that for white people, racism is a bonding practice. It's one of the ways in which racism is allowed to, and white supremacy is allowed to reproduce itself so effectively, is because the other is so thoroughly dehumanized over the course of their lives if they're not forced to engage with people of color at an early age. Casual dehumanization of who they are and what they go through. One of the most like famous abhorrent examples was the George Floyd challenge, when after that story went viral and people were seeing the videos of it, there are white people, as a joke, reenacting the murder of George Floyd and like taking pictures of themselves while standing on someone else's neck. I bring all this up because historically, young white men drop racial slurs against black people and make that type of comedy. It's obviously offensive, but I find myself being dispassionate about it because it's almost discerned. It's just to bring attention to themselves. And it works partially in part because of how offensive it is. You know, him doing that is exactly, it's a phrase. You get it.
It's like, I hate to always bring him up, but this is what Jeffree Star was doing on MySpace in 2005.
Yeah.
Literally the exact screaming slurs at unhoused people on the streets and getting boosts online because of that. So it's like, it's a tried and true engagement strategy for like young, disaffected white men. And the other thing this reminds me of is last year I interviewed this young man named Stephen Ime, who is a former looks maxer, and he's a young black college student. And he told me like he was really into looks maxing, same age as Braden, but he got the unfortunate reckoning with the fact that the community was so racist. He would make content and then he would be confronted with this reality that like and so that was his moment of like, it pierced the veil of cognitive dissonance. And he was like, this can't work for me. But for someone like Braden, he's getting validation by doing this. Like the racism is cooked into.
The concept of beauty in a Western sense is intrinsically tied to white supremacy. When you go and you look at how, old Western philosophy, but they were creating the building blocks of it.
Totally. I mean, to your point, FD, the parasocial bonding experience he was exercising online with a lot of like young white men worked. Clavicular blows up on Kick in the fall of 2025. Like, this is all super recent, how quickly this all happened. He became one of Kick's top streamers. Sidebar, if you don't know what Kick is, it is a lot of top influencers promote for some ungodly and soulless reason. The people who made Stake made Kick after Twitch banned advertising from gambling websites like Stake. So Kick became a vessel to advertise Stake and attracted content creators to the platform with a generous 95 to 5% split of subscription revenue, which is basically unheard of. Clavicular begins making up to hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. He became known for streaming constantly, sometimes for hours. Some 19-year-old girlfriend with fat-dissolving peptides in her face to reshape her jaw. Hello. Editing Matt here, and I had to insert this point that between the time we recorded this episode and when we are uploading it, the teenager we just described, whose name is Alexandra Mendoza, who's now 18, has filed a lawsuit against Clavicular alleging sexual battery, saying that Clavicular gave her too much alcohol to the point where she could not consent to sex, as well as an unauthorized injection of a non-FDA approved drug during a live stream, as we just explained to you. So there is that. He, like I said, was advocating for this. Have you guys ever seen Clavicular's content?
Mainly just through clips.
Only in clips from other people.
Just through the clipping economy.
Yeah.
And there is a big clipping economy. Basically, people who take like 1 to 2 minute clips of Clavicular's hours-long streams, disseminate them on places like Twitter. Clavicular's live streams, if you've never seen them, they are sort of like a cartoonish depiction of like a Miami high roller. He is always either in his mansion, which I believe he's now living in the mansion that was previously home to the Bop House, the young OnlyFans girls. Miami is a crazy place. But he's always either in the house, on a boat, or in a nightclub. He's usually surrounded by other looks-maxing influencers, young men in tank tops, which I am wearing today. I call that, I don't know, fruity maxing. You know, they all have a look, like astoundingly wide jaws. So,
Gotta Google.
like astoundingly wide jaws. He's also usually flanked by young women who all look like Tana Mojo.
Make my history look weird.
No, she's at this point, given the circus of influencers we're describing, she's kind of just like a normie at this point.
This is Tana Mojo, or if this is a woman who just has made her face look exactly like Tana Mojo.
Clavicular is oftentimes taking some sort of drug, put a pin in that, and struggles through daily social interactions. He struggles through talking to women at the club. He struggles talking to other men. Like I said, I think an under-discussed part of the whole Clavicular spectacle is his neurodivergence.
I don't want to, blow my talking points about the media aspect, but I think it's very purposeful that the mainstream media is not engaging with not just that aspect, but all the other parts of what undergirds what he's doing, and how it's working so well for him.
Today's episode. Don't you just love when you get home after a long day, you open the fridge, the groceries, they're looking at you. They look good. They're waiting for you to do something with them, but you just don't have it in you to cook. That's just most days for me, so no judgment here. This type of rhetoric is tapping into, and I want to say, with regard to his specific referencing of like private equity firms buying up medical practices, and how a lot of doctors in places like New York City just helped elect Zohran Mamdani, because increasingly doctors, who we've always thought are the epitome of like, you've made it, you own your own practice, you have freedom, you aren't part of the working class if you're a doctor. But guess what? When private equity firms start buying up your medical practices and turning you into an employee with strict quotas of how many patients you have to see and how long you can spend with each one, well, now doctors are increasingly identifying as workers. So I think the class analysis here is really interesting.
I was just about to say, this is a perverted materialist analysis he is giving to us.
Exactly. Because what strikes me about Clavicular is he often correctly identifies the problems facing his generation, but offers, obviously, horrible solutions. But my problem, though, is that the mainstream media coverage of him, which Adam Friedland's not exactly mainstream media coverage, and so I'm not even referring to this interview, but a lot of the coverage can't even concede that he's tapping into real generational despair.
Yes.
Right.
You know?
Yes.
Yeah, so the media's role in general is to be a function of the state in so many ways. That's why even what we're doing now, while we are all independent, right, we don't answer, I'm assuming we don't answer to like greater resources except for a sponsor or two. Even the way these algorithms function, they function for the purpose of manufacturing consent. Even when you want to be transgressive or radical or whatever, then it's like, okay, but how can we atomize you as much as possible? How can we create rage cycles with you and your audience? How can we make sure that you're fighting with Hassan or insert other figure here instead of actually, building power. And I say that to say, for the still very mainstream media, which is not being watched by us as millennials, which is only being watched by boomers and older, for them, it's to reaffirm this image of young people's despair as a bunch of silly kids eating Tide Pods, that don't want to show up early for work and don't want to work hard. Like we did during the good old days when men were men and didn't bone smash. And so like, it doesn't surprise me that you're describing the media as treating it. They did this to PewDiePie 10 years ago. Now it's becoming harder for them because now more and more they have to engage with the clavicular in order to bring eyeballs to them because nobody under his around his age is watching mainstream news. But what it comes down to is they can't engage with him critically because that would mean engaging with everything critically, and their viewers don't want to hear that.
100%. When I first started reporting on influencers, it was around the time that studies were coming out, like surveys, showing that a huge percent so selfish. The idea was that this was the fault of the young people, that this was a character flaw, and that the reason why they wanted to be influencers instead of astronauts or scientists is because they were just like bad people.
Yes.
When the reality is, the reason that young people want to be influencers is because they see that it is one of the only pathways to actually like moving upwards in class. It is one of the only ways. All of the traditional pathways are broken. And in fact, like the millennial experience has informed the Gen Z, Gen Alpha attitude because millennials did everything what they were told to do. They took out the student loans, they went to four-year colleges, degrees, they even got PhDs, and then they were ejected into a job market where there were no roles for them. And they have to work regular working class jobs just to try to survive and pay back those loans. And we hear about this all the time, the younger generations. So of course we don't want to make the same mistakes. Of course we want to follow the other pathway that is so visible to us that the mainstream media, despite questioning this, has like broadcast to us, which is like, oh my gosh, all these young people don't even have to work hard and just make millions of dollars on the internet. And the sad reality is that that's not true either. Influencing is also not a pathway to guaranteed or like lazy fallacy. And young people like feeling this way is not crazy. It is informed by like what actually happened to the generation before us.
Yes, 100 million%. It's the new American dream. And I want to take the pin out of that conference, that leadership conference that I mentioned at the very beginning of the episode that I was at, with all of these people who are older than me and very few of whom spend a good amount of time on the internet. And a lot of them worked in tech and a lot of them work in AI. And I can tell you, and I was so excited to record a podcast where I could like tell people this, that by the way, guys, when it comes to the future and securing a future that has job stability for young people, the emperor has no clothes. All of these people will say, yes, it's going to change up the job market, but young people understand AI and young people will know how to turn this into new job categories. They have no plan. And we already know that AI is eating the bottom rung of jobs in all of these different industries, leaving young people no path to enter those industries to begin with. And young people, while they might not be able to articulate the very nature of all of this, they know that those opportunities are gone. That is where this nihilism comes from. They know about AI. They know the future that has been guaranteed to young people for the past several decades with college leading to jobs, etc., is gone. So when Clavicular says, why take out all these student loans when I can just be an influencer? Well, you can laugh at him all you want, but guess who else feels that way? Basically everyone his age and younger.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm an older millennial. I'm 43, right? I'll be 44 in about a month. I'm of like the last past the post in terms of like, hey, all these structures that we raised you all on and set up for you guys, they actually work. And like literally, I crossed the finish line just before they all became completely dysfunctional. They were kind of breaking down when I got there, but it was just halfway functional enough that I could make something out of myself without ever becoming an influencer, right? But you have to be reminded, as Kat kind of alluded to, that the rest of these kids, the younger millennials and now the Z's and eventually the alphas, they're like, this is bullshit. What are you talking about? What do you mean work hard, get a job? Like you?
Yeah.
Yeah, they know it's a joke.
Ironically, I have found, like, in my years of, like, working for various mainstream media companies, within the media ranks, I think that there is this sort of, like, resentment toward influencers, because I think a lot of people working for the mainstream media actually blame the symptoms to be the cause. Like, mainstream journalists, that job market has never been great, and now it is literally like, it is the last remaining people who are about to be pushed off of a cliff. And I think a lot of journalists feel like influencers took our jobs, and so a lot of the coverage of influencers and of social media platforms is very resentful and very angry and very like, they want to stick it to them. They want to humiliate influencers. They want to like knock influencers down a peg. But unfortunately, like now it's reaching a really interesting point in like journalism culture, because so many journalists are influencers now.
Right. They got to get that Substack popping.
Exactly. Many of the journalists who are still at these major publications are like clinging to that idea that like influencers are the enemy, instead of the reality, which is like our economic mode of capitalism has failed. We are like go all plunging into an abyss together, and like taking shots at like someone else who's just trying to like survive and thrive is not going to help anybody. That's how I feel watching a lot of this coverage.
Speaking of which, Clavicular did an extremely viral interview with a notably handsome interviewer for 60 Minutes Australia. The interview is about an hour long, focuses heavily on Clavicular's looks-maxing tactics, particularly bone smashing, and the interviewer is smirking, borderline laughing through the whole thing. And look, on one hand, I can understand why, but it all just comes across to me as extremely incurious. And for a serious journalistic outlet like 60 Minutes to be taking this approach struck me as just like not doing your job.
Are you mugging me right now?
Well, in what metric?
Any?
Status mugging.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, like I might be status mugging you maybe. I don't know, you're fine. Like potentially money mugging, who's to say, right? I don't know, but like, you know, those are different types of mogs that you could achieve on someone. It doesn't only pertain to looks, right? So there's all types of mogs.
Well, your whole persona and shtick is about appearance and looks, right? So your whole persona and shtick is about appearance and looks, right? So would you say your looks mugging me right now?
I can't really see you, to be fair. It's kind of hard with the light. The camera's quite far away. So I'll just give it to you.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I can't see.
Why did they leave this in?
The whole interview is like that. Also, he's saying I can't see you super well because they're not in the same room, and he's looking at a laptop screen of this guy that's far away, and the light is in his face.
Yeah, and college professor explaining to a freshman student, like, what you think is not accurate. I'm trying to explain to you the basis of my culture, and you're just sitting here asking me unserious questions.
Which I actually appreciate. Like, I appreciate the farce in it all to an extent. I often don't get to see straight white men like try to explain the nuances of a culture. It's like somebody on TikTok needs to just do an animatic of that as yaoi, because that is how yaoi goes. That's how it goes. It's a Yuki and Simi. Uki and Simi, there's two like roles of dominance. The unseriousness of it just leads me to continue down that path.
Clavicular is like the Connor story, and the interviewer is like the Hudson Williams if this was heated rivalry.
This is not where I thought this was going.
And like, okay, another critique of this that I often have of how like mainstream media covers influencers is like the content that is being created, whether it's a 60 minutes episode or like a 60-minute long YouTube video, they are competing in the same environments for the same theoretically like audience pool. And a lot of times like mainstream media is subjected to the exact same dynamics that online content creators are. And we talk about this with online content, like how striving for virality tends to flatten things because you are going to get more attention with like a quick, snappy clip out of context than with a lengthy, nuanced discussion that actually like probes systemic factors. And we criticize like viral content and social media content for these dynamics, but the exact same dynamics also exist in mainstream media, where there is more value to creating a clip. You're going to get more viewers, you're going to go more viral if you have a clip of an interviewer asking Clavicular, "Are you mogging me right now?" than if you have an interviewer asking Clavicular about like generational despair and economic anxiety. So really, these are two people trying to do kind of the same thing, and that becomes very obvious when you have these interactions like this.
And to that end, the interviewer then asks Clavicular if he believes what he says, and this is how it goes.
It's fascinating talking to you. I feel like you're a very different person face to face than the persona you give out online. Do you believe half the stuff you say?
Do I believe half the stuff I say? So what are you saying? Inauthentic?
I'm just curious that is a lot of what you say on your videos and online about gaining attention more than necessarily it being what you truly believe?
In terms of streaming, yeah, like a lot of the activities that I do, like, you know, clubbing every day, you know, doing certain activities like that. Is that something I would do if I wasn't a content creator? No. So that part is, I guess you could say, just for virality. You know, I'm a pretty sheltered person. I, you know, like to spend a version of myself, but everything I talk about in regards to looks maxing in my philosophy, it's 100% real.
What an earnest response about how he is performing for cameras because he believes that that's all he can do. And to a certain extent, like, I don't know, is he wrong?
No.
Well, to Clavicular's point, which is something I never thought I would say, the reaction online to this interview that I saw, the viral reaction to this interview.
The character, personality, maturity, intelligence are far more important than appearance. Do you think I'm wrong?
Well, bingo, there it is. But those are all perceived entirely differently, once again, based on your looks. So you're absolutely correct. You're just forgetting that key piece of nuance.
Clav, the character, intelligence are far more important than appearance. Do you think I'm wrong?
Well, bingo, there it is. But those are all perceived entirely differently, once again, based on your looks. So you're absolutely correct.
It's like,
Oh man, is Clavicular the leftist prince that was promised?
he's identifying the problem, and the interviewer is like laughing and just being like, that's not true. It's like, hello, you're a gorgeous man doing an on-screen interview. Why do you think that is?
Right. Poorly.
This is, again, like, this feeds into the nihilism of the young, because young people aren't stupid. And like, you see Donald Trump in office, and then you get on here and you're like, being intelligent and kind is what matters most. Clearly, that's not true. It all contributes to the decline in institutional trust, because when people sit there and tell you things that so blatantly contradict with reality, like, you hear that enough times and you're just like, oh, all of the institutions are lying to me. Like, this is how I feel like a lot of young people are sort of like radicalized into like nihilism, and then also these extremely toxic subcultures, because it feels like someone is finally telling them the truth, even if like what is actually being told is this very like skewed portrait of reality. But at least it seems to hit on something that like the mainstream media is not willing to say.
The interviewer persists.
But see, I disagree, Clav. I don't think appearance is as important as you're suggesting.
Do you think that if you were bald, if you were fat, that you would be doing this interview, that you would be a journalist?
Yeah, I do.
Well, I would tell you that it's very unlikely that you would have the career that you do if you didn't have, the looks package. That's really what it comes down to. Like you see a lot of media personalities with full heads of hair, generally in shape.
Yeah, I do.
Well, I would tell you that it's very unlikely that you would have the career that you do if you didn't have, the looks package. That's really what it comes down to. Like you see a lot of media personalities with full heads of hair, generally in shape, and that's what it comes down to.
See, again, I disagree. Do you not think there are bald, overweight journalists?
Of course I do, but I'm just saying you would have had to overcome that disparity by being a lot better in other metrics to have the career that you do.
He's woke maxing right now.
The interviewer had thought some of this through. I don't mean to dog on 60 Minutes Australia, but we all are. And for you to just be well, that's not true. Who are some of the most successful on-screen male broadcast journalists? Anderson Cooper, David Muir, attractive, fit men with full heads of hair, and white, by the way, and chiseled jaws.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty ridiculous to assert the claim that, tons of people who don't conform to the beauty standard are successful in very visible positions, because it's just not reality. And while, yes...
Attractive, fit men with full heads of hair, and white, by the way, and chiseled jaws.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty ridiculous to assert the claim that, tons of people who don't conform to the beauty standard are successful in very visible positions, because it's just not reality. And while, yes, there are a lot of journalists who don't conform to beauty standards, or aren't conforming in, the highest echelons of beauty standards, those are not usually the people on camera. Your pathway in life is going to change based on how people perceive your appearance. This should not be controversial to say, because it's just reflected in all of the available data and reality that we live in.
What we're actually witnessing in a surreal way that I wasn't expecting before we started this call is the rejection of clavicular in the process of protecting white supremacy. It's not a sentence I thought I was going to make, but what clavicular is the white supremacy's greatest trick is maintaining invisibility in society, maintaining imperceptibility. You're not supposed to notice white supremacy. In a recent video, I compared it to dark matter and the universe. I don't know if anybody's a science nerd, but dark matter is literally what makes up most of the universe, not stars or proton clouds or whatever, but literal matter you can't see. But when scientists analyzed the math behind the universe, they had to make up the concept of dark matter in order to make the universe function properly. So you don't know it's there, but it's the most thing around us. Same thing with white supremacy. What this interviewer would have to engage with is the white and patriarchal nature of how he is privileged in Western society as not just a good-looking, and not just a man, but a good-looking, straight white man. Means that he started from at least 4 or 5 notches ahead of all of his would-be competitors. And it's not a surprise that we've only had straight white male presidents, that most of them do not, Donald Trump is anomalous in that he looks like a weird cartoon character figure. Most of them do look like who we talked about earlier, that Moggs, JD Vance.
Oh, Gavin Newsom, yeah.
Most of them look like Gavin Newsom, That is not an accidental thing, that is structural and systemic. And so this looks maxing thing is accidentally kind of materialist in its breakdown of societal forces. And in doing that and then platforming him, they have to completely ignore that part. in order to maintain the narrative around.
Advocates for the use of skin lightening cream on for an interview, and then being like, well, why would you do that? The world's not racist. It's like, well, neither of you are, what? Like, no, it's, and this is the fundamental conservative worldview of Clavicular, right? He's saying the world has all of these structures, and he's correct in identifying them. And he's saying that's just the way it is, so you might as well try your hardest to survive and come out on top, lest you be a loser and get left behind. But this interviewer is doing nothing for anybody, least of all the viewer, by ignoring the reality that Clavicular is saying we should all just do our best to survive under. Like, the leftist critique here is like, yeah, we have a world that values those things and prioritizes attractive people in all sorts of ways, and we should fight against that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She just started a movie that was about how bad beauty standards are. And I'm like, you misunderstood the plot of The Substance. You misunderstood what The Substance was trying to say. The point of The Substance is not just like beauty standards are bad. The point of The Substance is that women in the entertainment industry have to conform to impossible standards of beauty, or else they will lose economic opportunities. They will be ejected once they surpass a certain age, no matter how well they conformed in their youth. And that's what people misunderstand about so much of this culture is like exist. Because to do that would also not solve any of them. It's just pretending the problem isn't real.
Somebody just needs to hand this guy a couple of books, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
We'll have two Hassans.
We could fix Clavicular.
Wait, you mean Clavicular or the journalist?
No, Clavicular.
I think they could both read personally, but you know, no shade. The last clip I want to play for you from this interview is at the end when he asks if Clavicular is happy.
You don't give off this sense that you're incredibly happy and fulfilled. I'm wondering, Clav, do you live a happy, fulfilling life?
I would say for the most part I do. I just generally don't want to be doing this right now. I had something else I had to do.
What am I keeping you from?
I wanted to go to a club.
Is that your idea of fun, going to the club?
Well, I mean, maybe it's not the most enjoyable activity, but it'd certainly be a lot more fun than this. No offense.
What does he like to do?
I mean, it's hard to know what he actually likes to do because he just does whatever he needs to do for his like 24-hour streams, which is like going out and then going home and then going out and then going home. But it's just so funny as this whole interview unwinds and I watch the full hour and this guy just becomes like Fox News. It's like, oh, really? You want to go to the club? Is that what you think is fun? Like, yeah, he's fucking 20.
Yeah.
I hate how much I have to like fucking advocate for fucking Clavicular, but he's 20 years old. Of course he wants to go to the club instead of doing this dog shit 60 Minutes interview. Anyway.
Unfortunately, he humor mogged the interviewer a lot.
That was revealing and astounding. And I mean, it makes me come back to that initial take of like the thing that people sometimes missed about Jordan Peterson, and really all of the Manosphere folks, is that they are responding to the material world in a maladaptive way, right? The reason why these entities are powerful and require us to struggle against them is because they provide community to young men, a more diverse group of young men than people often realize, that are incapable of getting it elsewhere due to the ravages of capitalism and late capitalism. To have someone like beforehand, Jordan Peterson, who felt like an elder, you know, for a generation where a lot of people were fatherless or who had inadequate fathering in the home, to, you know, to engage with their emotional cores that are neglected, creates connection, which is what everybody's missing. They're missing connection to other people. And so for whatever reason, Clavicular and his lifestyle makes people feel connected. If you don't acknowledge why that's possible, you're just kind of making content. You know, that's what this really is. Just content.
Exactly.
The ad space.
Here's where we can take the pin out of what the broad reaction was to this interview, which, Kat, do you want to say?
Well, everyone was like, it's so funny that they put Clavicular with this really hot Australian broadcaster. And people were like, he's actually hotter than Clavicular. And that was the main takeaway. I saw people like takeaway from this interview was like, actually the broadcaster's hotter than him.
The only tweets I saw with hundreds of thousands of likes were like, oh, I bet Clavicular is shaking in his boots because the interviewer is hotter than him. And I'm like, guess whose worldview you are reinforcing right now?
Yep.
Jesus.
It's very silly to me.
And like, honestly, like scrolling through any social media platform on any given day will reinforce Clavicular's worldview, which is why he has it. Because if you are a young person who is spending a lot of time on social media, as all people for the most part now are, then of course you're gonna walk away with this worldview, because that is how people treat you. They make snap judgments based on your appearance, and then that dictates how they respond to anything that comes out of your mouth.
Right.
Wild business.
Around this time,
I might argue that I'm mogging you right now.
Okay, well, that's a fair perspective.
Piers Morgan, here's a clip.
I might argue that I'm mogging you right now.
Okay, well, that's a fair perspective. Go for it.
For those who don't know what I just said, what does mogging mean?
Basically outshining someone, looking better than them. And there's different types of mogs, right? There's status mogs, there's, money mogs. So, you might have me in those categories, but I think we need to add in a little bit of nuance that it's not a looks mog,
So you would say that you have the edge over me.
So,
yeah, but youth
who knows?
isn't
Back
always
in the
everything.
day.
Youth, a lot of women find the older dude. A lot of women find the older dude more appealing than the young, pimply youth,
Well, absolutely.
Can I just say,
This is farcical.
Clavicular could not have been nicer in this situation, where Piers Morgan is like, oh, do you think you're look smogging me? And Clavicular in that situation,
That was a good impression, Matt.
he could have literally said anything, and Clavicular was like, maybe by just a hair, but also I have youth on my side. And then Piers responds by calling him pimply? What?
This is content, though. This is content.
It is. And I also think that Piers Morgan and Clavicular are speaking the money and more power and more satiric around men, women, and the value that they have to provide to each other. But it's all rooted in the exact same thing.
This is what frustrates me about content creation, like amongst us. I haven't watched too many Clavicular videos, and no shade to different creators, but all of them have mostly done a lefty intellectual version of what Piers Morgan just did, right?
Yep.
It's mostly just like, isn't this guy weird? And I hadn't seen anyone engage with the critique that Clavicular presents to society. And now even more so, has been everywhere. 60 Minutes, Adam Friedland, so on and so forth. And I'm like, man, this is a lot of media attention for a guy that clearly doesn't have a whole lot to say. And it isn't even like, it's not that engaging. You all have ignored all the other aspects of the manosphere. Why is this one in particular of such importance to platform in all these spaces? And I realize it's because he's saying the quiet part out loud about the structural frameworks of our society, and they need to engage with it in order to pillory it so it sounds silly. Because this is maybe a bit of a reach. There's a framework of analysis happening here that a handful of these people might catch wind to, and then they might reach out about the structural frameworks to platform in all these spaces. And I realize it's because he's saying the quiet part out loud about the structural frameworks of our society, and they need to engage with it in order to pillory it so it sounds silly. Because this is maybe a bit of a reach. There's a framework of analysis happening here that a handful of these people might catch wind to, and then they might fuck around and hear this podcast. Hopefully. That's wishful thinking, obviously, but and he's doing that, and they're like, no, you're silly. You're silly, I'm mogging you.
I think that that's really true. And I also think that, and again, this reinforces Clavicular's worldview, but I suspect that another reason why like all of these media outlets are willing and eager to profile him is because he is an attractive young man. Like, again, not endorsing the things he's done to get there, but like he has succeeded in becoming very conventionally attractive. And I think he was to begin with, going back to that yearbook photo. But like, Asmongold is a influencer who has a much bigger audience, I think, than Clavicular. And you never see the mainstream media talk about that guy. And he is not conventionally attractive. And I think that is a big point why. I think like news agencies famously love interviewing hot people and spotlighting hot people's stories. Because again, I hate to say it, but to Clavicular's point, you will be more visible in society if you conform to these beauty standards. And like, if you really wanted to talk about people who are influencing young men, you would see more of this.
Care home and the mechanic. On top of that, fiscal policy remains remarkably loose. The US government is expected to run a deficit exceeding 7% of GDP this year, which is the sort of number you usually only see during a war or a major recession, not during a period of full employment. And financial conditions are much more accommodating than the Federal Reserve's headline interest rate would suggest. Credit spreads are tight, household wealth is at record levels, and private credit markets are supplying nearly $2 trillion of alternative financing that sits completely outside the traditional banking system. As Posen put it on the Odd Lots podcast a few months ago, the Fed has tightened, but the economy hasn't really noticed. Finally, and this may be the most important piece, inflation expectations are beginning to drift. When people experience price increases on highly visible, frequent purchases, eggs, gasoline, home repairs, they start to expect higher prices in the future. They demand higher wages, businesses raise prices in anticipation of higher costs. It becomes self-reinforcing. This is exactly what Paul Volcker warned about in 1979, when he said that inflation feeds in part on itself. The problem today is that after the pandemic surge, inflation never truly returned to 2%. We're entering this new energy shock with an economy that was already primed for higher prices, which is not an ideal starting position. This brings us to the question of who actually pays for all of this, because the inflation problem and the government spending problem are not separate issues. They are the same problem. To understand why government deficits are expanding at such a rapid pace, we have to look back to the 1960s, when an economist named William Baumol asked a fairly simple question. He wanted to understand why a string quartet playing Beethoven should be paid any more today than they were 100 years earlier. The instruments, he argued, are exactly the same. The sheet music is the same, the number of people required to play the piece hasn't changed, and the musician's productivity has not improved at all. The answer, it turns out, is that the rest of the economy had become more productive. And in such an environment, if you didn't pay musicians a higher wage, they would simply give up the violin and go work somewhere else. So to keep the quartet playing, the concert venue has to pay them more, and ticket prices have to go up. This concept is known as Baumol's cost disease, and while it's very useful for explaining why concert tickets are expensive, it also explains the structural nightmare currently facing global government budgets. I should clarify that when economists talk about a lack of productivity in certain jobs, they aren't insulting anyone's work ethic. In economics, productivity just means output per hour. A factory worker with a new machine can build 10 times as many cars today as they could 50 years ago. But a nurse, no matter how hard they work, can still only care for one patient at a time. This type of work is strictly constrained by the linear nature of time, which economists generally find quite frustrating. As Pradhan and Goodhart point out, the classic examples of bomb oil's cost disease are education and healthcare. They are highly labour-intensive services that are provided in person and are thus famously resistant to productivity gains. And while an ageing population might not need much in the way of primary schooling, they do require an exponential increase in medical care. As the proportion of elderly people rises, so does the incidence of neurodegenerative diseases and the complex comorbidities that come with living longer. And despite what our tech elites might like to tell us, your grandparents are highly unlikely to be satisfied with a robot visiting them in the care home. Japan has actually been trying that approach for years, spending billions on healthcare robotics, and only 2% of its caregivers regularly use them. The elderly require human carers, and because those carers have the option of working in other increasingly productive sectors of the economy, you have to pay them steadily higher wages to maintain the exact same level of care. You are essentially paying more and more for the string quartet, except the quartet is your entire healthcare system and the audience is getting older by the day. This all brings us to the fiscal problem. Because healthcare spending is structurally locked in to rise much faster than GDP, governments are staring down the barrel of massive structural deficits that have very little to do with which party happens to be in power. In the United States, the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed by the current administration will add roughly $4 trillion to the national debt over the next decade. And there's also the well-known Social Security cliff approaching in 2033, when the trust fund that pays retirees is expected to run dry. Pradhan and Goodhart believe, and I think most honest observers would agree, that when that moment arrives, the politicians of the day will bail the system out, rather than impose a 24% cut in benefits on the most reliable voting bloc in America. If you ask a politician how they plan to pay for all of this, they'll invariably point to a spreadsheet showing that their policies will generate a massive boom in GDP growth. This boom will supposedly lead to huge primary surpluses at some vaguely defined point in the future. This sounds great, except that these promised future surpluses almost never actually materialize. They serve as a convenient accounting fiction, allowing the current administrations to spend money today while leaving the bill for whoever happens to be sitting in office a decade from now. The result is a slow, grinding structural deterioration in the public finances of almost every major economy. And when governments can't or won't fix their fiscal problems through spending cuts or tax increases, the pressure inevitably lands on the one institution that can still print money. If governments are unwilling to cut spending or raise taxes, they have to find more creative ways to manage the debt. In the United States, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has chosen a particular approach, actively shifting the government's borrowing towards the short end of the yield curve, issuing more Treasury bills and fewer long-dated bonds. There's a certain irony in this. During the previous administration, Bessent was among the most vocal critics of Janet Yellen for doing essentially the exact same thing. His argument was a serious one, that the Treasury market derives its special status precisely from not being managed for short-term convenience. The United States government can borrow more cheaply than almost any other entity on Earth because the Treasury market is the deepest, most liquid, and most stable asset market in the world. Investors accept lower yields in exchange for that reliability. When you start gaming the maturity structure for political advantage, you erode the very thing that makes US debt special, and that tends to show up eventually in higher borrowing costs. It was a compelling critique at the time, and it remains a compelling critique today, which makes it all the more remarkable that the man who made it is now doing precisely what he warned against. The logic behind the strategy is straightforward. Short-term rates are lower, so borrowing short saves money today. And if you believe that rates will fall significantly in the future, you avoid locking in today's higher long-term yields. The problem is the other side of that bet. When you borrow short, you have to keep rolling the debt over. And if rates don't fall, you find yourself refinancing at whatever rate the market is charging at the time. Given everything that we've just discussed, structural inflation, aging demographics, persistent fiscal deficits, there's no obvious macroeconomic reason to expect a dramatic decline in interest rates. The strategy makes sense if you believe that the pandemic-era interest rate environment was normal and will return. Most of the evidence suggests that it was not, and that it will not. There is one component of the inflation picture that both the Treasury and most traditional macroeconomic models tend to quietly set aside, and that is housing. Shelter costs make up more than a third of the consumer price index, the single largest component of any category. If you read the research predicting a return to low inflation, you'll notice that housing is almost entirely absent from the analysis. That is quite an omission. In the year to March, US shelter costs rose by 3%, already above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, while overall inflation came in at 3.3%. And critically, the official CPI measure actually understates the real-time pressure because it captures rents across all existing leases rather than what new tenants and new buyers are actually paying today.
Need help scaling your business? You need Upwork. With Upwork, you can find and hire freelance experts in over 125 categories. It's fast and simple.
Hey, anyone currently looking for somewhere to live knows that the number on the ground feels considerably worse than 3%. The reasons are structural. Tariffs have driven up the cost of construction materials. The contraction in the labor force has tightened the supply of construction workers, and mortgage rates above 6% have created what economists call the lock-in effect. Existing homeowners refuse to sell because moving would mean surrendering the cheap fixed rate that they locked in years ago. The result is a market with almost no supply, rising costs of new construction, and no obvious relief mechanism in sight. New household formation still happens. People still fall in love and want somewhere to live. But increasingly, that requires building a new home at precisely the moment when building one has never been more expensive. And as I've discussed in previous videos, the broader story of housing affordability across the developed world, where house prices have risen far faster than wages for 3 decades, is now creating a self-reinforcing intergenerational problem that no government seems willing or able to solve. Older homeowners vote in large numbers and have direct financial interest in keeping prices high. Politicians who propose serious measures to increase supply are essentially asking their most reliable constituency to accept a fall in their net worth, which is one of the reasons that the problem has persisted for as long as it has. For the purposes of this video, though, the key point is simpler. Housing inflation is structural, it's understated in the official data, and it's not going away, which means that the single largest component of the inflation basket is working against anyone who's hoping for a return to 2%. If you look at all of these factors, the housing market, the tightening labor market, the trade barriers, and the fiscal deficits, you might assume that the public is fully aware of the inflation risk building in the system. According to a recent NBER working paper on inflation expectations, they are not. The researchers studied how ordinary people and businesses form their inflation expectations, and they discovered a pattern they call the cycle of selective inattention. It turns out that when inflation is low and stable, people simply do not pay attention to monetary policy. They ignore the Federal Reserve, they don't know what the inflation target is, and they go about their lives. This is entirely rational behavior. you don't tend to read the terms and conditions of your home insurance policy until water's already pouring through the ceiling. But when inflation surges, as it did after the pandemic, people suddenly start paying very close attention. They check the news, they learn about the Fed, and they start tracking inflation data. The problem is that they're learning about monetary policy at the exact moment when the central bank appears to be failing, which means the only lesson they ever absorb is a negative one. I mentioned earlier that inflation expectations are beginning to drift. The new research helps explain why this is so dangerous. When people expect higher prices, they demand higher wages, businesses raise prices in anticipation. It becomes self-reinforcing, which is precisely what happened in the 1970s. The paper points out that the recent trajectory of household inflation expectations looks almost identical to the lead-up to the inflation surge of 1974, which is, generally speaking, a suboptimal baseline for long-term price stability. This brings us to the political reality of central banking. If the Federal Reserve wants to bring inflation back down, it has to keep interest rates restrictive. But restrictive monetary policy makes government debt more expensive to service, slows the economy, and makes politicians deeply uncomfortable, particularly politicians who are running for re-election. As Pradhan and Goodhart point out, in any lasting conflict between governments and central banks, the central banks lose. This is not a partisan observation. It's been true under governments of every political stripe, in every country for as long as central banks have existed. When fiscal conditions deteriorate and the debt keeps rising, the political pressure to cut rates becomes overwhelming, regardless of what inflation is doing. We are already seeing this tension play out. The current US administration has offered some rather direct feedback to the Fed chair on social media, initiated a Department of Justice investigation into the central bank's office renovations, and nominated Kevin Warsh to take over the institution. Warsh has called for what he describes as regime change at the Fed, which is an unusual choice of words when discussing monetary policy, but it would be a mistake to treat this as a uniquely American or uniquely partisan problem. The research on central bank independence suggests that amongst the strongest predictors of whether a central bank will lose control of inflation are frequent turnover of its leadership and being pressured to buy government debt directly.
Hello? You there?
Hiring and no response? Not with ZipRecruiter. Post your job on ZipRecruiter in minutes, and we'll quickly find the best people for all your roles. Post jobs for free today.
ZipRecruiter. $37 a month to protect my family. It only took me 10 minutes to get coverage. It was 100% online, and I didn't even need to take a medical exam.
That could help cover our living expenses. That could help put my kids through college if something happens to me.
Yeah, man. Ethos.com. It's super easy, and you can get coverage.
In Turkey and Argentina, we've seen what happens when politicians take full control of monetary policy. You get rapid turnover of central bank governors, the government forces the bank to buy its bonds, and the currency loses its purchasing power. The advanced economies are obviously in a very different position. They've deeper capital markets, stronger institutions, and the enormous advantage of borrowing in their own currencies, but the underlying mechanics of inflation do not change depending on the size of your economy. When a government runs persistent deficits and refuses to cut spending or raise taxes, the pressure to monetize that debt, to quietly print the difference, becomes very difficult for any central bank to resist indefinitely. It is, for all intents and purposes, a slow-motion tax on everyone holding the currency. And unlike an actual tax, no one has to vote for it. For the last 30 years, the world essentially operated as one massive optimized factory. If something was cheaper to build in Germany or China or Taiwan, that's where it was built, and we relied on an open, peaceful ocean to deliver it. That system was extraordinarily efficient. It was also one of the great disinflationary forces of the modern era. But as the events in the Straits of Hormuz have demonstrated, an open and peaceful ocean is no longer a guaranteed feature of the global economy. The breakdown of international alliances and the return of geopolitical conflict means that countries are suddenly realizing that they cannot rely on their historical partners. This presents a rather practical problem for anyone who happens to rely on electricity, food, or the internet. Adam Posner has pointed out that Canada recently discovered it has almost no internet infrastructure that operates independently of the United States. All of their cables and satellites run through their southern neighbour. For decades, this was perfectly fine. You don't worry about concentration risk when the relationship is stable. But in a world where the terms of any international relationship can shift rapidly, that kind of dependency starts to look like a vulnerability. And Canada is not unusual in this regard. Most countries have similar single points of failure that they never thought to worry about. So you have to build redundancy, and redundancy is expensive. Europe is facing its biggest geopolitical challenge since the Second World War. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states are increasing their defense spending dramatically. Germany has launched new fiscal expansions to rebuild its military capacity. Across the globe, governments are being forced to duplicate supply chains, build redundant energy infrastructure, and onshore manufacturing that they used to happily outsource. You are essentially taking money away from productive private investment and pouring it into government spending, just to ensure that the lights stay on and the internet keeps working when the next crisis hits. None of this adds to the productive capacity of the economy. All of it adds to the deficit. And this creates a cycle that's very difficult to break. More defense and infrastructure spending widens government deficits. Those deficits put pressure on the central bank to keep borrowing costs manageable. The central bank accommodates the politicians, as Pradhan and Goodhart argue they eventually will, by keeping interest rates lower than they should be. That fuels inflation. The inflation erodes living standards, which fuels populism, which further undermines the credibility of the very institutions trying to manage the crisis. For 3 decades, central bankers had the wind at their backs. Cheap labor, cheap goods, open trade routes, and falling prices made the job look easy. Now the demographics have reversed. The trade routes are contested, the deficits are structural, and the politicians are telling the central bank what to do. The wind hasn't just changed direction, it's blowing directly into their faces. Pradhan and Goodhart call this the age of the unanchored central banker, an era in which the central bank can no longer single-mindedly pursue low and stable inflation, not because central bankers have become less competent, but because the structural conditions that allowed them to succeed have been removed. At this point, the data suggests that the only people left on Earth whose inflation expectations remain perfectly anchored at 2% is the Federal Open Market Committee itself, which is nice for them. For anyone who wants the detailed macroeconomic argument behind today's video, I'd highly recommend Pradhan and Goodhart's new book, The Unanchored Central Banker. I recently sat down with Manoj Pradhan to discuss it on my interviews channel, and you should watch that conversation now.